I was a good wife. I say that not from arrogance, but from honest accounting. I was attentive, communicative, willing to do the work. I read the books that couples therapists recommend. I initiated the difficult conversations instead of waiting for them to find me. I learned his love language, adjusted my behavior accordingly, showed up to our marriage with the same conscientiousness I brought to everything else in my life that mattered to me. I believed, genuinely and for a long time, that if I tried hard enough and loved carefully enough, the marriage would hold. What I did not understand, and what took me years to fully absorb, was that a marriage is not a project that one person can complete on behalf of two. We had met in our late 20s, and the early years were real. I want to say that clearly because it matters. The connection was genuine. The love was genuine. The life we built together in those first years was something I would not revise if I could. But somewhere in the middle years, around the time we moved from Seattle to Portland for his career, and I rebuilt mine from scratch in a new city, something shifted in a way that neither of us named in time. He withdrew in the way that some people withdraw when life becomes demanding. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just incrementally, a degree at a time, until the distance between us was significant and had been there long enough to feel like the natural state of things. I responded to the withdrawal by trying harder. That was my pattern, and I understand it now. When something I love feels like it is slipping, I tighten my grip, I increase my effort, I treat the problem as one of insufficient input. I suggested therapy. He agreed and came to 3 sessions, and then found reasons that the timing didn't work. I read about emotional unavailability and gently, carefully raised what I was reading in conversations that he received politely and did not continue. I planned weekends that were designed to reconnect us. Some of them worked in the temporary way that a good weekend can paper over a structural problem, and I would feel hopeful for a week or two before the distance returned. The moment I understood we were not going to make it was not a fight or a revelation. It was a Tuesday evening when I looked across the dinner table at the man I had been married to for 9 years and realized that I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the day I'd had. I was exhausted by the effort of maintaining a connection that only I was maintaining. I was tired of being the person who tried while trying not to seem like the person who was always trying. I was tired of hoping that the next conversation or the next weekend or the next attempt would be the one that met me halfway. I asked him that evening directly and without accusation whether he wanted to be in this marriage. He was quiet for a long time and then said he didn't know, which was the most honest thing he had said to me in years, and also the answer that told me everything. We separated 6 months later. The grief was real, and I did not rush it. But underneath the grief, eventually, was something I had not expected. A relief that had nothing to do with not loving him and everything to do with no longer carrying something alone that was meant to be shared. What I learned: effort is not sufficient when it is only coming from one direction. You cannot love someone into presence who has chosen, consciously or not, to be absent. And the failure of something you tried hard at is not evidence that you failed. It is sometimes evidence that you were the only one trying, which is a different thing entirely. Release the version of yourself that believes sufficient effort can compensate for another person's disengagement. It cannot. And you deserve a partnership, not a project.
We did everything right. I have gone back over it enough times now, with enough distance, to say that with reasonable confidence rather than defensiveness. The product was good, genuinely good, not founder-biased good, validated by users who paid for it and came back and told other people. The team was exceptional, the kind of group that forms once if you are lucky, and that I will spend the rest of my professional life feeling grateful to have worked alongside. The market we were entering was real and growing. We had raised enough capital to operate with intention rather than desperation. By every framework I knew how to apply, we were doing the things that were supposed to work. The company failed in its 4th year. Not dramatically. There was no scandal, no fraud, no catastrophic product failure. The market we had correctly identified as real and growing attracted 3 well-funded competitors within an 18-month window, 2 of them backed by capital that made ours look modest, one of them a division of a company so large that competing on price was simply not a category we could play in. We adapted, pivoted twice, found adjacent problems our product could solve. But the core market we had built for had become a place where we could not survive, and the pivots, though intelligent, came slightly too late to build the momentum they needed before the runway ended. I spent the first several months after the failure in a state I can only describe as dissonance, the experience of knowing, intellectually, that we had made good decisions and simultaneously feeling, emotionally, that failure is failure and must mean something was wrong. The mind searches for the error because the alternative, that you can do everything within your control correctly and still lose, is deeply uncomfortable. It destabilizes something foundational about the relationship between effort and outcome that most ambitious people have built their identity on. The version of the story that helped me most was told to me by an investor I had come to trust, someone who had seen enough companies to have a long view. She said that timing is the variable that almost no one can fully control and that almost everyone underestimates. That the same company, with the same product, the same team, and the same execution can succeed or fail based entirely on when it exists in the world, whether the infrastructure is ready, whether the cultural moment has arrived, whether the competitive landscape happens to be clear or crowded when you show up. She said she had funded companies indistinguishable from ours that had become significant businesses, and the primary difference she could identify was not the quality of the founding, but the year. I found that both clarifying and maddening, which I think is the appropriate response. What I rebuilt on the other side of the failure was different in ways I did not anticipate. I became more honest about the role of luck in outcomes, not as an excuse, but as a genuine intellectual position, the understanding that outcomes are produced by skill and effort and circumstances in proportions that are impossible to precisely separate. I became more compassionate toward other founders in difficulty. I became, I think, a better operator. Not because the failure taught me better tactics, but because it taught me equanimity, the ability to execute well even when the outcome is not confirmed. What I learned: failure is not always a diagnosis. Sometimes it is a weather report, information about conditions that were outside your control, arriving in the most expensive possible format. Do the honest audit, extract what is genuinely learnable, and then release the rest. Carrying the failure as evidence of your inadequacy when it was evidence of your timing is a weight you were not meant to carry. Build again. The timing will be different.
I prepared carefully. That is where this story begins, with the particular thoroughness of someone who has decided that if preparation is possible, then preparation is required, who responds to uncertainty by converting as much of it as possible into something controllable. I ate the right things from the month before we started trying. I tracked everything there was to track. I took the supplements, eliminated the things worth eliminating, exercised in the ways recommended, and stopped the ways not recommended. I was calm about it in public and privately obsessive in the way that only made sense to me. building a structure of correct behavior around the pregnancy as if the structure itself could guarantee what structures cannot guarantee. The miscarriage happened at 11 weeks. It was our second attempt, and the first had also ended this way. And standing in the doctor's office receiving the information for the second time, I felt something shift in me that was different from the first time. Not more grief exactly, but a different kind. The grief that arrives when you understand that doing everything right is not the protection you believed it was. The months that followed were some of the most quietly difficult of my life. Not difficult in ways that were visible. I went to work. I was present in my relationships. I did not fall apart in the ways that would have signaled to other people that I needed something. I fell apart in the private ways, in the bathroom before work and on the drive home and in the specific hour between 3 and 4 in the morning that became, for a while, reliably mine. Grief has its own schedule, and it does not consult yours. What made it harder was the question I could not stop asking. The one that my rational mind understood was unanswerable, and that I asked anyway because the alternative, accepting that there was no answer, was its own kind of loss. What did I do wrong? I reviewed my behavior compulsively and found nothing I would change, and that finding did not help me the way I thought it would because it left me without the thing I was looking for, which was the error I could correct. My doctor was honest with me in a way that I needed and was not ready for. She told me that first trimester losses are common beyond what most people know, that they happen frequently to healthy women doing everything correctly, that the body has its own complex and sometimes painful process of determining which pregnancies continue, and that the lifestyle factors I had been so carefully managing were meaningful at the margins but were not the primary variables. She told me this gently, and I sat with it and then went home and cried for a long time. We have a daughter now. She is 4 and entirely herself, loud and particular and astonishing in the way that children are when you understand at a cellular level what it took to get to them. The losses before her are not erased by her existence, and I do not think they should be. They are part of the story, part of what I carry, part of what made her arrival feel like something beyond what I had words for. What I learned: there are things in this life that are not problems to be solved by better preparation. The body has its own processes, its own timeline, its own losses that have nothing to do with your adequacy or your effort. Doing everything right is worth doing. It matters at the margins, and it gives you something to hold on to. But it is not a guarantee, and treating it as one sets you up for a particularly cruel confusion when things still go wrong. Some of what happens to us is simply outside the reach of our best efforts. That is not a failure. That is being human.
I spent 4 months preparing for that interview process. I say 4 months because that is when I first identified the company as somewhere I wanted to work. Not 4 months of obsessive daily preparation, but 4 months of consistent, deliberate effort that I fit around the job I already had. I researched the company deeply enough that I could speak to their strategy in ways that went beyond what their website offered. I prepared answers for every behavioral question I had ever encountered and several I invented. I did mock interviews with 2 friends who had been through similar processes, and with a career coach I paid out of my own savings because I believed the investment was worth it. I was ready in a way I had never been ready for anything professional. I made it through 5 rounds, 5 conversations, each one building on the last, each one leaving me with the specific cautious optimism of someone who is trying not to count something that isn't confirmed. After the 5th round, the recruiter told me that the feedback had been excellent, that I was one of 2 final candidates, and that a decision would be made within the week. The rejection came on a Thursday by email. The email was gracious and said the decision had been extremely difficult, and that the role had ultimately gone to a candidate whose background was a slightly closer match for a specific aspect of the position. It said they hoped to stay in touch and would keep my information on file. I read it twice, put my phone face down on the desk, and sat very still for several minutes. The specific pain of that kind of rejection, the kind that comes after maximum effort and strong feedback and proximity to the thing you wanted, is different from ordinary disappointment. It does not have the comfortable cushion of knowing you could have tried harder. There is no revision available. You did the work. You were good enough to be a finalist, and someone else was chosen. And the margin between you and them may have had nothing to do with merit. I went through the reasonable stages of processing it. I asked the recruiter for feedback, received something politely nonspecific, and accepted that the specifics were not going to be available to me. I talked to the career coach, who pointed out things I already knew about the process being inherently imprecise and the final decision often coming down to factors that had nothing to do with candidate quality. I understood all of this. Understanding it did not make the Thursday much easier. What helped, eventually, was not reframing the rejection, but simply continuing. I applied to other roles. Not immediately. I gave myself a week before I opened the laptop again, because forcing momentum before the disappointment had settled felt dishonest. But then I continued, with the same preparation and the same effort, because the alternative was to let one outcome tell me something about my capacity that one outcome does not have the authority to tell me. I have a job now that I like more than I would have liked that one. I cannot know that with certainty, but I believe it. The company whose culture I have experienced from the inside is different from the company I studied from the outside, and the difference is significant. What I learned, a process that you execute well, is worth executing well, regardless of the outcome, because the outcome of any single process is not a reliable measure of your quality. Hiring decisions, like most decisions made by humans under uncertainty, are imprecise. You can be the right person and not get the role. You can be exceptional and lose to someone who was also exceptional. The rejection is real, and it is allowed to hurt. And then you continue, because continuing is the only thing that eventually produces the outcome. And your preparation is not wasted. It compounds.